Today's lecture, if you look at the online guide, is supposed to be about Martin Luther King, the establishment of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, as well as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And I'm going to do my absolute best to get us to that moment. We should be able to do it. But because of the lost lecture due to the midterm, this is sort of my last attempt to get us back on schedule. So I want to canvass a slightly larger period. Today I plan on discussing some critical aspects of the Montgomery bus boycott and the integration of Central High School in Little Rock, events from 55, 56, 57. By doing so, it allows me to talk about a very important aspect of the movement that I've made an allusion to already once or twice in the course, but you'll certainly see it coming up time and again over the next few weeks of the course, and that is the issue of respectability. Just as we can look at the late 19th century and issues of being civilized, of having proper sort of normed middle class behaviors is very important to at least the black leadership, elite class. Being respectable, being the right kind of person is fundamental to understanding a lot of the civil rights struggles. Now let's look at the Montgomery bus boycott, and I'm going to presume that in the history of the Montgomery bus boycott and the desegregation of Central High School, this is now American History 101, that you should have had the gloss of it when you're in high school, and I'm sure you didn't get much more than the gloss, and I'm sure the gloss was wrong. But what I want to do is actually give you, you know, the mythic narrative of these things, which is there for a reason, and I want to give you some background details that are important to consider. So as far as the boycott is concerned, the Montgomery bus boycott, there's a standard history that has become mythic. Rosa Parks, the tired seamstress, refuses to give up her seat on the bus in Montgomery, and she gets arrested. Martin Luther King comes swooping in to her rescue and then rises to the national scene with his leadership of the year-long boycott, 13-month boycott that would ensue shortly thereafter. I was looking at the syllabus last night and realized I dropped a reading for you, and I want to encourage you to go back and look at it now. I'm referencing it right now. I believe it's pages 352 to 361 in the Manning Marable anthology. It just slipped out of the syllabus by accident. And in those pages, you'll see Joanne Gibson Robinson, a prominent black woman in Montgomery, explain her version of the events around the bus boycott. Just even knowing about Joanne Gibson Robinson changes the story of the bus boycott. Robinson was part of a cadre of middle-class African-American women, sort of think of the club women from the late 19th century that I talked about a few weeks ago, who had already organized into a force, the Women's Political Council. These were women who were well-educated, college-educated, some of them teaching at a local college. These were sort of the elite, although they weren't rolling in money. These were the elite in black Montgomery. The Women's Political Council, with Joanne Gibson Robinson's leadership, she's one of the key figures in it, has already gone to the black ministers in town and the city government in town about their frustration over the way that blacks are treated on the buses and the way they are treated in stores downtown. Economic boycott is the words they are floating around. They wanted to try to develop the courage in the black community to get a boycott organized. The Women's Political Council keeps running into dead ends in various places. They might get a meeting, but the meeting, frankly, where men were in the leadership position would be rather condescending to the women. That's very sweet of you to come in, but we'll take care of things. Now nothing would happen. Now, the Women's Political Council actually tries to organize boycotts of the buses around issues of crisis, and this is when other people get arrested for refusing to give up their seat. Now, if you look at the selection in the Marable reading and Joanne Gibson Robinson's recounting of the bus boycott and Rosa Parks' arrest, you might find something striking. When I was actually going back and looking at it tonight, like, God, how did I forget to include this? If you scan it, as I did several times, for Martin Luther King's role, you will only see King's name mentioned once, and quite literally in the second to last line, I believe, of this reading. Now, this is an excerpt, granted, things might have been dropped out, But if nothing else, metaphorically, it's actually a very important point. King was not there, not engaged in the organizing early organizing moments of the bus boycott, what would turn into the bus boycott. Now, why bother telling this story? Just because it's inserting new cast of characters? Well, maybe that's part of it. Maybe because it's pointing to the role that women played in the movement, had always played in the movement. That's certainly part of it as well. But another part of it's important to know is that the bus boycott its success was incumbent upon many different factors. It wasn't just King's charisma, although we cannot ever discount King's charisma. Part of it was dealing with an already established and organized, politically organized black middle class that is basically organizing done through their women. There's already then a network of activists in place upon which King's charisma could be displayed, or through which. I don't know what the right descriptor is. It basically starts to muddy up the narrative of the civil rights movement, this amazing moment of the movement. But there's more to the story, always, more complicating factors. Rosa Parks was arrested, there's no doubt about that. But it wasn't as spontaneous as history makes it out to be. Now, Parks is referred to as the mother of the movement, partly because of her indisputable character. She was as proper as one could imagine. She was hardworking, she was civil, she was law-abiding. She's the perfect person to become a victim, of it were, of an insane system. If you can't treat this person properly, there's something fundamentally wrong with your system. We know that about Rosa Parks. What we don't know is that she'd been trained at a Civil Rights Institute the summer before she decides to get arrested, the Highlander School in Tennessee. Parks was reluctant to go, but she had friends who were already committed to the movement in very public ways, convinced her to come along. And while there, she's meeting with white radicals, labor activists, Communist Party members, other black activists from around the country, and learning about nonviolent civil disobedience, learning about different strategies in which to create a crisis for the sake of the greater good. So Rosa Parks, now she's not a fire-breathing radical. She's not at the vanguard, but she is trained, and she's prepared for that moment when it actually happens. That's dropped out of the history. Another thing that's dropped out of the history is she was not the first woman to be, or person, but in this case, first woman to be arrested for violating etiquette on the buses, certainly not in Montgomery, certainly not in other places. In fact, a few weeks before Parks was arrested, a young woman named Claudette Colvin was arrested in a similar situation. A boycott almost emerged, organized by the Women's Political Council, and a boycott almost emerged revolving around Colvin's arrest. She was a straight-A student. She seemed to be an impeccable character. If you're treating a child like this, how could you how could you claim to be humane? Turns out, though, that very quickly they discovered that they couldn't use her, Colvin, as a vehicle for their boycott, because this straight-A student of unimpeachable character, unmarried of course, also happened to be pregnant. She's not showing at the moment. People in Montgomery, black activists, realized right away there's no case that they cannot make a case around her because of Southern traditions that would say that she was immoral for her, quote, condition. And that would have been a word that would have been used. And they knew that they could not make a convincing case if they have someone with such failed standards, such immorality in her system, that she'd be the worst example for these movement activists. The activists understood that being respectable in a very narrow band of what that means was absolutely critical. Respectability is so important to the movement because anything that transgressed a line of being respectable could be used to justify a denial of some sort, whether it's legal, you can't come to this school, whether it's psychological, I can limit your entire existence in terms of possibilities, or whether it's physical, I can kill you. Let's just go back to Brown v. Board and the reactions to it. I already told you about Melba Beale's experience as she's about to be raped when she's 12 years old. But we can see in reactions in other places in the South, systemic reactions, the extent or the ways in which there was a logic that blacks had to behave just right because the stakes were so high. In the wake of Brown v. Board, in July of '54, the White Citizens Council is formed. I'm simplifying it a lot, but think of it as the upper crust Ku Klux Klan. Business leaders, white males, prominent figures in these southern towns would organize, southern cities, organize themselves, fund Klan activities, making sure in a variety of ways that there would not be an integration or destruction of their social order. Economic warfare happens across the South with city leaders, white citizens councils, battling it out with radicals, the most proper radicals like Joanne Gibson Robinson. Governments start responding. This arcane little caveat excuse me, the loss of words here, in how governments interact. The doctrine of interposition, it's a weird phrase, the doctrine of interposition is invoked by Southerners, saying that the federal government had no power to interfere in states. This goes back to 1832 or something like that. Completely ignored little tidbit attached on some bill somewhere. Southern governors and governments start invoking the doctrine of interposition, saying the federal government had no power to interfere in states. Federal officials from the South, members of the House of Representatives and Senate, gather together and author the Southern Manifesto, saying that Brown was a clear abuse of judicial power. Only one member from the federal delegation in the South refused to participate, and that's Al Gore Sr. from Tennessee. Wait, I might be blanking on that. Might just Kefauver, yeah, thank you.
And Lyndon Johnson.
Was it 3?
It was 3.
Well, there you go, it's 3. Well done. Where'd you learn this history? You take this class last year?
No, I took a paper on post-war America.
Excellent, well done. You're trained by somebody well. Anyway, but thank you. There was all but 3 of, I think, maybe 100 people.
No, there were representatives who didn't do it, including Rayburn.
Oh, well, hell, apparently I don't know the history at all. Anyway, the point of this is why it's so dangerous to talk to students at Yale. The fact is the Southern Manifesto is a declaration that Brown doesn't carry weight. There's going to be a negative, a response of resistance, and the phrase becomes known as massive resistance. That the South is going to refuse to proceed forward with the logic coming down from the Supreme Court. People start becoming targeted. NAACP as an organization becomes targeted by Southern legislatures, saying the NAACP had to reveal its membership list in order to stay in business. As an organization had to reveal who's in its membership. This is basically a death warrant to the organization in some states and to people who were members. If you're known to be a member of the NAACP and working in Mississippi, well, you know, the boss might decide you don't have your job any longer for some other trumped up reason. And it might actually get you killed. Violence takes on Gothic proportions in Mississippi more than any other place. In '55, several black leaders urging blacks to vote were murdered, one on the local courthouse lawn. The president of a local NAACP chapter was shot down when he ignored the order to remove his name from the voting register. And then, of course, there was Emmett Till, 14-year-old boy, sent from Chicago to stay with his family in Mississippi. There are many different versions of what happens. The allegation is that he whistled one day, hanging out with his cousins, that he whistled at a white storekeeper's wife when she walked past. Others have countered, saying he had a stutter and, you know, he would often lisp as a result. What actually happened at that moment is really inconsequential. What happens later is of great consequence. That night he's abducted, he's beaten, One of his eyes is gouged out. He's wrapped in barbed wire and tied to farm equipment before being thrown over a bridge. When they find him, his body is sent surreptitiously up to Chicago. His mother insists on having an open casket at the Chicago funeral, and the images shocked the country. There's a clip here. That opens up with Mose Wright, who was Emmett Till's uncle, who makes a very famous declaration going into court. And he points out the people who came to get Emmett Till from him, which meant he could no longer live in Mississippi. He vacated right away in order that he might live to see another day.
Where is it? The sheriff came and told me they had found the body at Till and wanted me to go and identify the body, which I did. And we found the body. We didn't have on any clothes at all. The body was so badly damaged that we couldn't hardly just tell who he was. But we happened to have on a ring with his initials. That said it up.
The body was shipped home, back north to Chicago, where Mamie Till Bradley insisted on an open casket funeral. So all the world can see, she said, what they did to my boy. Showed Till's corpse, beaten, mutilated, shot through the head. A generation of black people would remember the horror of that photo.
I believe that the whole United States is mourning with me. And if the death of my son can mean something to the other unfortunate people all over the world, then for him to have died a hero would mean more to me than for him just to have died.
When you heard the narrator, Julian Bond, talking about a generation, would never forget this murder and the image that appeared in Jet magazine. He wasn't exaggerating. One of my former colleagues, her father was from Louisiana, from rural part of Louisiana, and he was visiting. We were having lunch together, dinner together, and Emmett Till came up. I can't remember why, but he said he was 14 or 15 years old when Emmett Till was murdered, and he knew then that he had to leave the South as soon as he could, and in fact, he never went back. And he said he has never forgotten that. And he knew that there was no hope for, as he put it, a black man in the Deep South. Now, there's a court case. There's an all-white and all-male jury. The jury deliberates for 67 minutes. One jury said later it wouldn't have taken so long if they hadn't stopped to get a soda. And the jury finds the defendants not guilty, although everybody knew who did it. January 56, 1 month after Park's arrest in Montgomery, Look magazine publishes an interview of the Till defendants in which they state for the record that they had in fact killed him. Now, this is the most spectacular and perhaps egregious case of violence gone unpunished, but there were other episodes and some of them happened as a direct result of Brown. I already again related to you the attempted rape of Melba Beals, but violence is endemic. In fact, it's one of the great stories of this nonviolent civil rights movement is that it was horribly violent. And it's rather shocking it did not become more violent at any given moment. Now, thinking of violence and respectability and narratives of the civil rights movement leads us to the Little Rock Nine. And I have to gloss over the history very quickly for the sake of time. Melba Beals goes on, the person who was 12 years old when someone loses his mind and tries to attack her, goes on to become one of 9 teenagers who are eventually selected by NAACP activists to integrate Little Rock Central High School. They're focusing on Arkansas because it seemed to be one of the most progressive states in the South on these issues. Other school systems in Arkansas had actually already integrated. But Central was the most important, most visible high school in the state. The 9 who were selected were amazing students, academically gifted, coming from the right families, who comported themselves in the right way. Otherwise, they would never have been selected. Without going over too much of the famous integration of Central High, we point out a few things that one needs to remember. The students are selected to integrate in '57. There's fierce local resistance. The governor, Orville Faubus, calls in the Arkansas National Guard to prevent integration. President Eisenhower, very unhappy about the whole scene, sends in the 101st Airborne to force the issue. And he does it not because he believed in integration, but because he believed in the federal government's right to assert itself. This is a states' rights versus federal rights issue for Eisenhower. The troops ushered in the students after they had already tried to integrate the school before but were harassed by mobs outside of the building. The students, the troops could go with the students up to the door of the classroom, but in the classroom or in the bathroom or in the cafeteria, all hell broke loose. One student had lye thrown in her face, almost permanently blinded. Students would talk about being in the bathroom and then going to the bathroom, and then paper towels had been lit on fire being thrown overhead when they were helpless. They were attacked, books were thrown down, food poured on them, but they could not respond. The one student who did respond got kicked out, at which point they said, 1 nigger down, 8 more to go, trying to get these students out of the school. Houses were bombed, people were shot at, folks lost their jobs. Now think about all this. What is it that's being asked of these children? And they are children. Going back to Melba Beals, there's a few items from her diary entry, New Year's Day in 1958, that allow us to ask some pretty important questions. 4 different items, selected from a longer list, is 1, to behave in a way that pleases mother and grandma, 2 people who are very central in her life. To keep faith and understand more of how Gandhi behaved when his life was really hard. To pray daily for the strength not to fight back. And the resolution that she put as number 1 was to do my best to stay alive until May 29th, the end of the school year. I mean, think about it. NAACP activists, grown women and men, are making sure the children are to stay in school, despite the violence being visited upon them. And it's very fair to ask, is it appropriate for 16-year-olds to feel the need to write in their diaries that the most important New Year's resolution is to do my best to stay alive until the end of the school year? What are the adults asking the children to do for the sake of the movement? It's a question that would come up quite angrily in 1963 in the Birmingham crisis. Now, one final note about the school year and Little Rock. What we don't often hear about, well, we basically never hear about Central High School history, is that the governor, because it's a triumphant moment, right? So the governor was so upset about the public relations disaster that accompanied the school's integration that he decided to shut down Little Rock public schools the following year. The integration of the school, this great moment of civil rights victory, of American exceptionalism, lasted 1 year, and the public schools were shut down. Why don't we know this part of the history? You know, there's something really maybe too tantalizing about these nice narratives of our past. We can be ashamed of the shortcomings of our predecessors, but by keeping the story clean and simple, we can also be proud that our predecessors ultimately made the right decision and did the right things. In short, the civil rights movement has been sanitized because it ultimately casts a great light on the American character. That, you know, the American character can take its lumps, learn from its mistakes, and then do great things. The civil rights movement has been cast as a great moment of American exceptionalism when we all summoned the courage to do the right things, regardless of our political positions, where we are in the country, et cetera. Well, that's just one big fat lie. Only a minority of folks rose to the challenge and accepted it and pursued it. Martin Luther King's history is a case in point as far as rising to a challenge and as far as what happens when a history is sanitized profoundly. King is raised in a tradition of ministers. His father and grandfather run the most elite black church in Atlanta. King has a rather raucous adolescence and college years. He and his buddy go around trying to run competitions about, you know, who could deflower the most girls in the language of the day. He does receive a religious calling, however, goes off to seminary and then gets a PhD at Boston University, a PhD which scholars discovered, much to their great disappointment about 2 decades ago, that he had plagiarized parts of it. King, though, these things aren't widely known at this moment in time, in 55. He's seen as a real future star. And he gets a job in Montgomery, heading the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, which is, much in the tradition of his father and grandfather, the most elite, sort of upstanding, and politically conservative, quiescent church in that particular city. He's relatively newly married. He and his wife Coretta have a newborn. He wants to settle into a nice, quiet pulpit and do nice, quiet work. Well, there's already things shifting around on the ground, with the Women's Political Council agitating for an economic boycott, trying to find a test case to boycott the buses. And the group of black ministers in town are very important people in a group called the Interdenominational Ministerial Alliance. A ton of syllables there. The Interdenominational Ministerial Alliance is feeling pressure from Women's Political Council to do something. King, as a minister, is automatically in that group. And then, as things start heating up towards what would become Rosa Parks' moment, King is thrust into the limelight in a way he never wanted. Parks gets arrested. King is sent as an emissary or sacrificial lamb, really more of the latter. The Montgomery Improvement Association is formed. This is going to be the group that's going to organize the boycotts. King does not want to lead it. The other ministers, who are deeply skeptical this thing will actually work, figure King just got here, he's young, he'll rebound when this thing blows apart, we'll put him out front. King couldn't say no. He fought, but he couldn't say no. He'd already resisted the invitation to head the local NAACP for the sake of his child's safety. Anyway, on December 5th, the night before the boycott's set to begin, King is still resisting the urging of the ministers and finally relents and writes out some notes on a piece of paper. Goes to the pulpit with about 10, 15 minutes to prepare and says, in part, the following. Now, the audio is not great, and I'll tell you what he says, but I want you to hear the energy of the moment during the closing moments of his speech. Oops. If we are wrong, he says, and we are not wrong in what we are doing. We are not wrong. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. If we are wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. If we are wrong, Jesus of Nazareth was merely a utopian dreamer that never came down to earth. If we are wrong, justice is a lie, love has no meaning, and we are determined here in Montgomery to work and fight until justice runs down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. You can tell the audience is going crazy. They're energized by this young man who's come out of nowhere. But think about what he's saying here. He invokes God and Jesus, and this is what one would expect, of course, but he invokes, the first part of this quote, the Supreme Court and the Constitution. He's invoking law. King is not invoking anything radical, as a matter of fact. He's invoking the Supreme Court and the Constitution. He's invoking those very things that made citizens citizens in the United States, after all. And perhaps that is the thing that made him so radical. Anyway, the movement takes off, and the boycott holds together. It's a remarkable history, although it wasn't the first boycott, bus boycott. The movement holds together for 13 months before the Supreme Court forces the integration of the buses. These are the same 13 months when massive resistance is rising up throughout the South. The same 13 months when Emmett Till is murdered, and the same 13 months when the strategy for Little Rock becomes articulated and starts to gain traction. Period of astonishing change. Now, King rises to prominence. He's traveling all around the country, constantly raising money during the bus boycott. They need resources and money to pay for gasoline and cars that are all shipped down to Montgomery to make this thing work. But he's not doing it by himself. He's aided by two people who are rather important. One is Bayard Rustin, who I've already mentioned before. Earlier part in his life, a member of the Young Communist League, a draft resistor, someone who was arrested on morals charges for being caught in the back seat of a car with another man. He's gay. Often recognized as one of the great organizing minds of the freedom struggles and labor struggles of the 20th century, but because of the politics of the day, hampered by his sexuality and by his communist past. But Bayard Rustin is in King's corner, telling him do this, do that, follow this particular path. King is also aided by Ella Baker. And by the way, Rustin and Baker are finally getting the attention that they deserve from amazing histories that have been written about 5 or 6 years ago. Ella Baker, a longtime activist who worked for unemployment councils in the Great Depression, certainly was affiliating with folks who were communist. Older woman who becomes hailed by a younger generation of activists who are just about to become known for being one of the most important leaders of the movement. Baker starts to work with King in advising him as well. Come back to them in a moment. As the boycott nears success, we see violence quite clearly. King's house is bombed. Other people are being shot at. It's a bloody mess. But Rustin sees in the success and the violence as a catalytic moment of possibility. And that the question becomes not so much how great was this moment, but what can we do to capitalize upon it? What can we do to sustain this organizing energy? There needs to be an organization. And he calls on King to bring together other leaders and essentially religious leaders to gather together to think of the next steps. And out of that comes the Southern Leadership Conference, is what the plan is, at least. The Southern Leadership Conference, bringing together, the great leaders in the South, African American, to become organized to have sustained change. Well, King makes a decision that infuriates Rustin, and they have a very tense relationship in general. Rustin recognizing King's astonishing gifts as a speaker and King recognizing Rustin's astonishing gifts as an organizer and political thinker. King never likes the fact that Rustin is gay and talks condescendingly to Rustin about it. Rustin always underestimates, in King's opinion, the role of religion in this movement. So Rustin calls for the Southern Leadership Conference, and King changes its name with sort of fiat, to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, becomes one of the most important civil rights organizations for the next, really for the next 20, 30 years. King's popularity skyrockets with the success of the bus boycott. He's increasingly drawn away from the pulpit as he travels about trying to raise consciousness and funds. And by January of 1960, having barely been in the pulpit at Dexter over the previous few years, he leaves. And he's not ministering to that church. The SCLC, what he now heads, excuse me, bless you. The SCLC is now focusing on leadership training and citizenship education. Now, as the SCLC emerges out of King's success and wrapped up in his charisma, it creates stress in the system. You see stress often embodied in intergroup squabbling, something you'll see a lot throughout the 1960s. Established organizations like the NAACP is not too thrilled about the SCLC arriving on the scene because they're competing for the same people in the same dollars, scant dollars. In fact, Medgar Evers, who's the head of the Mississippi NAACP, who joins the SCLC, this new group, was told he had to choose. You either pick with SCLC or you pick the NAACP. He says the NAACP. Now, the NAACP is already under stress. Talked about the fact that its roles are being opened up by Southern legislatures. But there's also stress internally through people like Robert Williams, military vet from North Carolina, who becomes fed up with events in his town, where he's the head of the local NAACP chapter, and calls for retaliatory violence. He's kicked out of the NAACP by the end of the 1950s. So the NAACP is struggling with rising, percolating spots of militancy. People leaving the message behind at the NAACP. And now this new group appears on the scene that might pull away other supporters. The important thing to know, I guess, from that, I suppose, is that neither the SCLC nor the NAACP had control over the movement. No single organization could claim they were the group that was running the movement. And while King is the most electrifying speaker of this great narrative, he hardly had any control over it. If you look to the events of February 1st, 1960, you can see the way in which there was sort of a wildcat mentality about many things happening in the movement. On that day, in Greensboro, North Carolina, 4 men, students of North Carolina A&T, black school, head to downtown Greensboro, not far away, and they decide that they're sick and tired of the treatment they're receiving at the Woolworths, the local 5 and dime, drugstore, convenience store. It's funny, when I began this course, when I began teaching it years ago, Woolworths were still around. Ain't so much still around anymore. But the history still is. So the men go to the lunch counter and insist on being served. They could buy things other places in the store, but they couldn't be served at the lunch counter. Waitress says, I can't help you out. And they sit there, and they sit, and they sit, and they sit, taking up 4 seats at the lunch counter. It's a wildcat sit-in. It's not the first by any stretch. March on Washington movement have been organizing them for decades. Labor movements have been organizing for decades. But this time it takes off. You have just the right mix of electricity, of anticipation, possibility, and frustration, certainly. And you see across the country sit-ins by people your age, all across the South. 60 cities become sites of sit-ins. And all of these sit-ins, the young men and women are well-dressed and impeccably mannered. To do anything else would invite potential death. Ella Baker, person who's essentially running the SCLC. King's the head of it, but Ella Baker's running it, administering it, taps into this energy and organizes a youth conference in Raleigh, North Carolina in April. She's expecting sort of a modest turnout, overwhelming turnout, an overwhelming energy. We, the college-age students of the day, need to do something. We are ready. And out of that organization grows the Southern Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, otherwise known as SNCC. I'm so Southern, I'm sorry, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, otherwise known as SNCC. SNCC would never become the biggest of the great civil rights organizations, but more than any other organization, it becomes the barometer of the evolution of 1960s ideology. And SNCC will be part of the narrative that I lay out over the next 2.5 weeks of the course, because through them you can actually see the changes, really quite radical changes in movement ideology during the 1960s. But at its founding moment in April of 1960, SNCC is a group of college-aged individuals who espoused nonviolent ideology, who were absolutely interracial, and who wanted to be organized through a non-hierarchical system. They are, from the beginning, seen as a temporary organization, literally given a corner space in the offices of the SCLC headquarters. So it's operating under SCLC's umbrella. SCLC thinking this is a great way to get more youth involved in our movement. You can even look back at the founding moment and see there's already some fissures in the relationship, if only because SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, is committed to a non-hierarchical organizing logic. They, like Ella Baker, are a little bit nervous in the fact that SCLC is embodied in King. A magnificent man, but a far from perfect man, but only one man. And they wanted an organization that had many leaders. Now, that's April of 1960. Heading into the fall, in October, King is arrested in Atlanta for violating probation and trumped up charges. And he's sentenced to I think it was a traffic violation. He's sentenced to 4 months hard labor. John F. Kennedy was campaigning for the presidency, calls Coretta Scott King and says that he will protect King. He actually had no way of protecting King. But in an orchestrated phone call, I will do everything I can to protect your husband. And with that, black support for Kennedy mushrooms. Kennedy goes on to win by 120,000 votes. Still debates whether those votes actually existed or not. But he won by 120,000 votes. And it's clear that it's African American support that swung the election his direction. Blacks have in JFK the kind of leader at a symbolic and cultural level they have not had since FDR started making these gestures towards recognizing blacks' needs some 25, 30 years earlier. In 1961, I'm skipping a ton of details, I'm trying to get up to a moment of most famous crisis. In 1961, CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, I mentioned in the last lecture, organizes a new round of freedom rides, getting on buses, integrated riders, and crossing state lines. Members of SNCC are on the bus as well. Students from Yale, from other places in Connecticut, jump on these buses and head on south. Once they cross into The Deep South, buses are attacked by smoke bombs, tires are slashed. As people run out of the buses to get away from the smoke, they're met by mobs who beat them with their fists, with metal poles. Buses are torched. Other buses are sent down. Eventually, the buses arrive down in Birmingham, Alabama, where Bull Connor, the commissioner of public safety, knows they're coming, knows there's a mob waiting for them at the bus station, and does not offer police protection, and lets the students, the riders, get beaten senseless for 15 minutes before letting the police come, before releasing the police. When people said, well, why did you do such a thing? He goes, it was Mother's Day. You can't take a man away from his mother. You know, they needed to have time spent with their mother. You know, they would get there in time. There's a dawning at this moment with this kind of violence and recalcitrance of a militancy within SNCC and the beginnings of a move away from respectability. You start seeing different agendas being articulated within different organizations. The movement is going in fits and starts. Federations form and break apart. There's all kinds of infighting. And things seemed on the verge of collapse in Albany, Georgia, when they go to invoke another crisis. And in Albany, Georgia, where you have a confederation of different civil rights organizations coming together to try to change that town, they're outsmarted by the white police. As the students try to start filling up the jails to create a crisis of overcrowding and get national sympathy, with the jail, no bail strategy, we let ourselves be jailed, we won't accept bail, they'll have to force us out, we won't have paid any bail, this will be great. The police chief says we're going to keep our heads and start shuttling people out of jails to other jails. He doesn't react, essentially. Nothing happens, everything fizzles. And there's a fear that this movement that began, quote, began, in quotes, with Brown v. Board and has these violent reactions. You see it with Rosa Parks, and you see it with Emmett Till, and you see it at Central High School. The beginning of a new sort of vibrant youth organization. It feels like it's all going to collapse in Albany, Georgia, because the white officers realized if we don't react, this thing will go away. Well, thank God for Bull Connor. I'll let the film tell you much of that story, but suffice it to say that Connor did more through his brutality to help win converts to the civil rights movement, more than anybody else could have practically done. I'll pick up on that moment, on that fact, at the next lecture. Thank you.